Don't talk to me. I'm tired.
When I told my husband, who had just returned from work, that dinner was ready, that's what he snapped back with. Seeing me at a loss for words, he sighed.
Really, you have it easy. I bet you've never considered what I'm thinking or doing. Being a good husband isn't a walk in the park.
My once calm and gentle husband seems to have vanished. His cold gaze pierces me. He knocked back the icy beer I'd set out for him in no time flat, then disappeared into our bedroom. From that moment on, it was as if I didn't exist to him. Every word out of his mouth seemed to cut deeper than the last. Things like,
Nicole, since you're working part-time, you should handle all the housework. And you're bringing in money now, so don't expect me to chip in for expenses.
Just like that, I found myself saddled with all the housework, and he didn't contribute a single cent to our living costs. Our only means of communication were messages over text, most of which he never even bothered to open. I kept asking myself how we ended up like this, and the answer hit me in a pretty unexpected way. I'm Nicole, a 30-year-old working part-time. I married Dan, my same-age partner, 3 years ago. We were set up by a friend who thought we might hit it off, and they were spot on. We clicked instantly and bonded over our shared love for books and our similar ways of thinking. Dan was such a gentle and kind-hearted guy that I fell head over heels in no time. After several dates, I was the one who suggested we make it official. Dan was on the same page, and we jumped into a relationship full of joy and excitement. We've managed to navigate our way this far without any big blowouts or fights. We've got a pretty fulfilling marriage, except for one big hiccup, and that's Dan's work situation. He's stuck in a textbook exploitative company, working unpaid overtime, getting called in on his days off without a moment's notice. There's a never-ending round of work parties disguised as client entertainment, and Dan always comes home exhausted. Hey, Dan, are you sure you're okay with this? How about considering a company where you can actually catch your breath?
Well, yeah, but I'm in the middle of a major project. Plus, it seems like my boss is expecting a lot from me.
Dan's a good guy, but struggles with making decisions and tends to get swayed easily. He's been mulling over the idea of changing jobs, but for various reasons, he's been unable to take that leap. I couldn't stand by and watch him get increasingly burned out, though. I talked to friends from college, older acquaintances, anyone who might know of better companies, and I started coming through job postings. I narrowed it down to around 10 companies and suggested that Dan give them a shot. I knew I was meddling, but he seemed grateful for the suggestion. Maybe he needed that little push. Either way, he threw himself into the job hunt, and finally he managed to switch to a company that treated its employees a lot better. The overtime is almost non-existent, they strictly observe the weekend, and he can actually take vacations and paid leave. Dan, who'd been physically and mentally drained, began to regain his vitality and seemed more lively since the job switch. I was beyond relieved that I'd pushed him to change jobs. I truly meant it from the bottom of my heart. Then, about 6 months after Dan made the switch, during a break at my part-time job, I noticed that he had tried to reach me. Wondering what was up, I stepped outside to return his call. Hello? Dan? What's going on? Dan picked up immediately, seeming to be on break too.
Sorry for the sudden ask, but can I invite my coworkers over this Sunday? They all are curious to meet you.
His request was unexpected, but not unwelcome. I was actually relieved that Dan seemed to be making friends at work. Absolutely! I've got the weekend off. Maybe I'll go out and cook up a storm, I replied, which seemed to cheer Dan up. Thanks. We chatted a bit more before ending the call. Okay, time to figure out the menu. A few days rolled by, and it was finally time to host Dan's coworkers. They all turned out to be senior members of his department. They were pretty decent folks, showing up with gifts and even lending a hand to set the table. Among them, a guy named Howell seemed particularly attentive to me, striking up a conversation.
So, Nicole, what do you usually get up to?
On my days off, I read, and recently Dan and I have been hitting the shops. Then Howell started throwing all sorts of questions my way.
I see.
But you also work, right? Do you and Dan split housework? Who manages your finances? Do you have an allowance system? How much do you typically spend on living expenses per month? His interrogation left me a bit startled. Why would he ask such things? Despite being Dan's senior, it felt intrusive. Caught off guard, I tried to laugh it off and looked to Dan for a rescue. Hey, Dan, could you lend me a hand with these empty cans? Dan, all smiles, obliged, and we both slipped away. Once in the kitchen, I expressed my discomfort to Dan about Howell's prying questions. He seemed a bit taken aback, but asked me to bear with it because Howell was a senior he looked up to. That didn't sit right with me, and I was about to voice my objections when Dan, as if deciding the conversation was over, shook his head and went back to entertain his coworkers. I was left feeling frustrated and muttered under my breath, out of everyone's earshot. What the heck? That day, unbeknownst to me, was a game changer in our relationship. Fast forward 2 months after we hosted Dan's coworkers, Dan started acting strange. He was more distant, even a bit cold. He just didn't feel like the Dan I knew. He had always been helpful with chores like cooking and cleaning, but recently, he'd completely stopped. Even though he now had more spare time than when he was slogging away at his old job, he didn't lift a finger around the house. Also, he hardly spoke to me anymore, giving curt answers to my attempts at conversation. He'd stopped accompanying me shopping too. After enduring this bizarre behavior for a while, I thought of proposing a vacation during the long holiday the following month. How about hitting the beach for the next long weekend? Remember that gorgeous place featured on TV the other day? I asked as Dan walked in from work. He shot me a quick look, but instead of replying, he just cracked open a beer and started drinking. When he didn't respond, I figured he didn't hear me and gave it another shot. Then out of the blue, he scrunched up his face and snapped. Give it a rest. Don't talk to me. I'm tired. His words knocked the wind out of me, and I was left speechless. Seeing my stunned face, he let out an exasperated sigh, downed his beer in one gulp, and vanished into her bedroom. After that, his already distant demeanor froze over completely. He started to brush me off whenever I tried to strike up a conversation and shot hurtful remarks like, Nicole, you have a part-time job, so you handle the chores. I'm not chipping in for the bill since you're bringing in money. He held true to his words, not shelling out a single cent, leaving me to juggle the chores and bills alone. I was at a loss, unable to fathom why he changed so drastically. Our attempts at discussion fell on deaf ears. Our only mode of communication was through text, which he would often ignore. Fear started creeping in, suggesting Dan might be cheating on me. Could it be that he's head over heels for another woman, leaving me out in the cold? The mere thought was unbearable, and I set out to gather evidence, sneakily checking his phone and his old social media accounts whenever he dozed off. I did find he was frequently calling his workplace senior Howell, whom he admired greatly, but I found no trace of infidelity. The mystery of Dan's chilly behavior left me feeling on edge, and the stress began taking a toll on my health, leading me to spend most of my free days in bed. One day, I woke up on the couch just as Dan was getting home from work. He flung his suit jacket at me, looked down at me with cold eyes, and barked, Hey, what's for dinner? I couldn't believe he showed no concern for his ailing wife. Fed up, I hurled his jacket back at him, retorting, Don't talk to me! I'm tired! Taken aback, he tried to backtrack. I mean, you didn't whip up dinner, huh? Seeing his discomfort, I stood up, fetched some documents from the cabinet, and shoved them under his nose. I'm stuck doing all the housework and footing all the bills. You ignore me, show no concern for my health. What's the point of being married? Look at these figures. I've got savings, and I make enough to get by on my own. As he stared at the bank documents, a look of confusion crossed his face. Huh? What are you trying to say? I'm saying I want a divorce. You're not into me anymore, right? If that's the case, there's no sense in being married. The truth is, when I started sniffing around for signs of Dan's possible infidelity, I also took up a side gig. If he was really messing around on the side, I was pretty sure we were headed for Splitsville. When I mentioned the D word, Dan looked like he'd been blindsided by a bus. I guess it really knocked him for a loop. He holed up in the bedroom, clutching his head. Not that it was going to change anything. Not long after, I could hear chatter from the bedroom. At first, I thought Dan was just talking to himself, but it turned out he was yakking away on the phone with someone. Maybe getting advice from his mom, who knows? I let him stew and started to pack up my stuff. I figured I'd bunk at my parents' until Dan simmered down. As I packed, I realized I didn't really have a ton of stuff. I mean, I could buy new clothes anytime, and as long as I had my precious stuff, I was golden. Okay, time to hit the road. Just as I was about to blow this popsicle stand, the doorbell rang. Talk about lousy timing. Already at the front door, I opened it with a sigh. And boy, was I floored by what I saw next. There, dressed to kill in a sharp suit and holding a bunch of roses, was Howell. Why in the world was Howell here, and all decked out? While I was gobsmacked, Dan, who was supposed to be on the phone in the bedroom, came barreling out. He started with a smile, but that faded into a look of utter confusion. Oblivious, or just ignoring the awkward situation, Howell gave me a warm smile and said, "Nicole, I've come to sweep you off your feet." Both Dan and I let out an incredulous, "What?" Dan snapped out of it before me and let loose. "Oh, I get it, Nicole. You're sneaking around with Howell, and that's why you're talking about divorce." I was about to set Dan straight on his wildly incorrect accusation, but Howell got there first. "Nicole cheating? No way. I admit, I'm sweet on Nicole. Fell for her the first day we met at this house." Howell continued, getting all nostalgic. "I wanted to go steady with her, but you were cramping my style, Dan. If you two split, though, that's another story." Howell shot Dan a loaded look. Something seemed to click for Dan, his voice shaking. "Oh, hold on. The advice about skipping housework to look macho or playing stingy with the living expenses so I wouldn't be taken for a ride? Bingo! All that advice was to get Nicole to dump you. I didn't think you'd swallow such dumb advice hook, line, and sinker." Howell had a good laugh at Dan's expense. I was too gobsmacked to say a word. Howell is single. Sure, he's good at his job and Dan respects him as a senior, but if he had thought things through, he'd have realized that advice was baloney. Dan's wishy-washy, easily swayed nature was really biting him in the butt now. "Everything played out just like I planned. You two are divorcing. Thanks, Dan, for the heads up and letting me come to whisk Nicole away." It all clicked into place. Howell showing up now, Dan on the phone with him earlier. No way. Howell couldn't be that ruthless, but he's actually here. Dan seemed to be spinning, cursing Howell one second and bemoaning being duped the next. After going through the motions, Dan finally turned to me. "You heard the whole shebang! This guy played me! I'm not the bad guy here, am I? Don't even mention divorce! Let's take it from the top." Dan shot me this weird half-laugh, half-cry look, but my mind was already made up. I don't need a dim-witted husband who'd rather believe some colleague over his wife. Hearing this, Dan, looking crestfallen, busted out laughing as if he'd lost it. Tears welled up in his eyes. Why on earth did he think I'd call off the divorce? Fed up with the drama, I grabbed my stuff to split, but Howell's blocking my way, eyes brimming with tears for reasons I couldn't fathom. "I'm over the moon. Nicole, you picked me over Dan." His triumphant laugh was soon replaced with a dead serious face. "Nicole, I love you. Please, be mine." "Not a chance! Why in the world would I pick you? You're creepy! You started this whole mess! I'll despise you forever!" When I spit this out, Howell, Mr. Confidence a second ago, was dumbstruck. Could you please just leave? If I see your face again, I'm calling the cops. Actually, I'm doing it right now. You make my skin crawl. Anger coursing through me, I whipped out my phone. Maybe it was the threat of calling the cops, but Howell's smug attitude changed in a flash, and he whimpered, "Please, anything but that," before hightailing it out of there. A month later, Dan and I were officially over and done. It all went down quicker than expected, thanks to my mother-in-law who persuaded Dan to agree to the divorce after she got the lowdown. Dan finally came to grips with what he'd done and apologized. For a moment there, I thought maybe if he was genuinely sorry, we could try again. But hearing about his shenanigans since then, any such feelings evaporated. Seems like after our split, a buddy introduced Dan to a woman, and he drove right in. Another buddy introduced him to another woman, and he started seeing her too. I knew he was a pushover, but this was beyond belief. Of course, it came to light that he was two-timing them, and the whole thing exploded in a crowded place. What a sorry spectacle. I made a promise to myself to erase Dan from my life. Since then, I haven't run into Howell, the cause of all this chaos. He must be terrified of being reported. From what I heard, he was so rattled by everything that he started blowing off work and got canned. He's since fallen off the grid. As for me, I decided to cut all ties and move far away. I'm now making more from my work-from-home gig than my part-time job, so moving wasn't a big deal. I found myself living solo for the first time in a while. Thought it'd be lonely, but it's been anything but. I work when I feel like it, eat when I'm hungry, and chill when I want to. Life's never been better. From now on, I'll forget about these losers and live for myself. That's what I was thinking, sipping my post-dinner coffee.